We're getting closer and closer to the World Series, which means the 2022 Major League Baseball season is almost over. And that means it's almost the Orioles offseason, which should be a big one for the O's. And I know you all have questions about this Orioles upcoming offseason. So we're going to open up the mailbag. It's a Mailbag Monday episode coming up right now on the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Monday, October 24th, 2022, and welcome back to the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are opening up the mailbag. We've got 9 listener questions, all from you all, to answer here on today's podcast. We're discussing a multitude of different topics, from what the Orioles are looking to do this offseason, what I would do if given a certain amount of money for the Orioles budget. We'll talk a bit about Jackson Holliday, what his expectations look like for next season. We'll talk a little bit more about the Jorge Lopez trade and much, much more coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is sponsored by Simply Safe Home Security. With Fast Protect technology exclusively from Simply Safe, 24/7 monitoring agents capture evidence to accurately verify a threat for a faster police response. There's no safe like Simply Safe. Visit simplysafe.com/lockedonmlb to learn more. And before we get to our mailbag episode, just want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first podcast listen of the day. We're free and available on all podcast listening platforms. We're still every day of the week, Monday through Friday, 5 episodes per week until the World Series ends. Then we cut down to 3 episodes a week for the rest of the offseason, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, with still all your Orioles content here at Locked On Orioles. So make sure to like and comment and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube page. Also subscribe wherever you listen, whether it be Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you could give us a 5-star rating and a review, that helps out the pod tremendously. And we thank you for submitting your mailbag questions as well. And we thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first podcast listen of the day. For your first listen today, let's jump right into the mailbag. These are 9 listener questions, all from, again, you, the listeners. If you want to submit a mailbag question for a future episode, tweet at us at Locked On Orioles or at Connor Newcomb _ or DM either account. You can put a comment in the YouTube comments to ask a question. You can email us at lockedonorioles@gmail.com. And you can also put a question in the review section on Apple Podcasts for the Locked On Orioles podcast. But this first question comes from Randall in the YouTube comments, who asks, what do the Orioles expect out of their backup catcher next season? Now, this is a good question because it's a topic we actually covered a lot on the podcast last week. Remember, the Orioles claimed 2 catchers from the Reds off waivers last week. We talked about it back on Monday's episode, Aramis Garcia and Mark Colesbury, both guys who played sparingly in the big leagues with the Reds, ended up kind of being the Reds' 3rd and 4th catchers this year at the big league level. Both were DFA'd. O's put them both on the 40-man just to have them. Of course, they also added Anthony Bemboom to the 40-man. They claimed Cam Gallagher from the Padres. He's on the 40-man roster, all along with Adley Rutschman, and all competing to be Adley's backup next year. And as we've talked about, there's still a lot of free agent candidates that they could bring in, similar to, but hopefully better than, a Robinson Chirinos. But I think what they're looking for next year is a little different than what they were looking for this year. What the O's looked for this year, when they eventually settled on Robinson Chirinos, was a veteran guy who had previous success with the glove and with the bat, and who could be kind of a mentor and a leader for the clubhouse and specifically for Adley Rutschman. And that's what they got out of Robinson Chirinos. And listen, Chirinos just fell off an absolute cliff. We talked about it last week when we reviewed his season. He had a 110 WRC plus with the Cubs last year. He was one of the worst hitters I've seen this year with the Orioles. And he was a terrible framer and a terrible defensive catcher. He was a good clubhouse leader, but that's not what they need next year when they're really trying to compete. What they're going to look for is a good framing catcher, high framing numbers, going to help your pitching staff, works well with the staff, good defensively, can block balls, can throw out some runners. A guy who is okay playing, sometimes at most 1 time a week, maybe at the absolute most twice a week, knowing that he's behind an all-star, a legit star in Adley Rutschman. And, you want a competent bat. Doesn't have to be a great bat. Doesn't have to be a guy that you're going to DH, sometimes. I don't think it's going to be Wilson Contreras or anyone like that or Gary Sanchez, but someone who can at least handle the bat a little better than Robinson Chirinos did. And then I don't think they any longer need like that grizzled veteran like Chirinos was, the 10-year big leaguer who has, been in the playoffs and been in the World Series, who's going to mentor Adley. Adley's been through almost an entire big league season now. He knows how good he is, and he's only going to get better. He doesn't really need that mentor figure, that big veteran figure behind him. Now, if they bring in a veteran, that's okay. That helps the team if it fits. But it could be a younger guy or a less established guy like a Cam Gallagher, or an Anthony Bemboom like we've talked about, if it fits the defensive profile with at least an okay bat. It doesn't really need to be that kind of clubhouse leadership guy anymore. Second question of the day comes from Pat. This also coming from the YouTube comments, who asks, who are the sneaky good prospects in the Orioles system? And I didn't want to name any guys who were like big name, even 20 through 30. So I just wanted to name a couple of guys. I came up with 4 names here for sneaky good prospects. And you're going to hear about some of these guys and more over at BSL On the Verge, a great podcast that covers all things Orioles minor leagues. Make sure to go check them out as well. But I'd say Trendon Craig is one guy who has gone under the radar. He was a 20th round draft pick by the Orioles back in 2021 out of junior college, actually the same JUCO that Cedric Mullins attended. He's a center fielder, plays good defense, and the bat started to come along at the end of the year between Delmarva and Aberdeen. I think he has some upside for the Orioles. Just haven't heard a lot about him. I like Brandon Young. He's a big, tall right-hander who was in Bowie this year. He was an undrafted free agent out of Louisiana after the 2020 draft. It was only 5 rounds. He had a good start to the year, but then went down with an injury and missed the rest of the season. Unsure, if he'll be able to start next year on time, but I do know when he does. Big frame, big stuff, good fastball, good breaking ball as well. I like Brandon Young. I think he's kind of your typical power righty with the curveball that can really get guys out. And I think he can flourish in the system next year as long as he is healthy. Another guy is Reed Trimble. And Trimble, pretty high draft pick, taking the first 3 rounds of the 2021 draft for the Orioles, the outfielder out of Southern Miss. But he's just been so injured since he got drafted that we really haven't seen much of him. He missed most of the season this year with the Orioles with an injury. When he did come back at the end of the year, he only played at Delmarva. He was kind of far behind the rest of his 2021 selections. I mean, Colton Cowser finished the year in AAA Norfolk, and Trimble was still in Delmarva near the end of the year. But, Trimble going to the Arizona Fall League to get some more at-bats. I think once he is fully healthy and ready to go in spring training next year, we're going to see that big bat, that great defense that the Orioles saw from him. And I think he is going to launch himself up the prospect boards for the Orioles when he gets back on the field next season. And then the last guy, kind of a deep cut reliever, is Xavier Moore. The Orioles acquired him in a minor league trade a couple of years back. He actually ended up being the closer for the Aberdeen Ironbirds at High A this year when they went to the South Atlantic League Championship Series. And he was a lockdown closer, had a sub-2 ERA this season. He has a wicked changeup. Now, his command is an issue, and he doesn't really have another, at least go-to pitch besides that changeup. It's not the greatest fastball in the world to go with it. But the changeup, when he can command it, just flies almost like a screwball down and away from left-handers. It has insane movement. And if he can work on the command of his pitches, he will be in the Bowie Bay Sox bullpen next year. And if he's pitching well in the Bowie bullpen, he's older. I believe he's 24, 25 years old. He could be closer to the majors than you think, Felix Bautista type, if he figures out that command, because he has some stuff that is definitely ridiculous out of the bullpen. Third question of the day also comes from Pat via YouTube. We thank you, Pat. He asks, what are your thoughts on Cade Povich at this point and the Jorge Lopez trade as a whole now that we have hit the offseason? Now, I've touched on this a little bit in the offseason already. Of course, talked about it a lot when the trade happened. The Orioles at the deadline, while in contention, dealing their closer, Jorge Lopez, to the Minnesota Twins for 4 pitching prospects. They got Cade Povich back, the left-hander. They got the righty Yenier Cano, who we saw a few times in the big leagues with the Orioles. And then they got the 2 kind of teenager or, low 20s age pitchers who were in the FCL in Juan Rojas and Juan Nunez in the deal as well. First, my thoughts on Povich. I think he's a solid left-handed pitching prospect. I mean, I don't think he's ever going to be a top 10 prospect in the Orioles system. I don't even think he's, a better prospect than Drew Rom is at this point, who, below DL Hall is the Orioles' top left-handed pitching prospect right now. I think there's some other lefties that have a higher ceiling than him in the system right now, but For what Povich is, a guy who can throw strikes, who has a big overhand curveball, a tall, lanky lefty with a good fastball. I think he's working on his secondaries as well. He had some ups, he had some downs in Double-A Bowie this year after the trade. I think he'll get sent back to Bowie next year, and then hopefully will get himself up to Triple-A Norfolk at some point next season. Then we'll really see how close he is to the big leagues. But I think, peak, maybe they've gotten a number 3 or 4 starter out of Cade Povich. I think he's more of a 4 to 5 starter in the big leagues. Hopefully that's what it is. But I do really think in terms of the trade in general, I think it's going to be graded out by how good either Juan Nunez or Juan Rojas are. I think those 2 younger pitchers who were dominating the FCL, I think one of those guys could end up being the centerpiece of this 4-player trade they got back for Jorge Lopez. And maybe, we look down the road 2 to 3 years from now, one of those guys is a key contributor on the mound for the Orioles in the big leagues. Maybe you look at this trade a little differently. I still don't think, though, they should have traded their closer at that point in the season. It affected the O's, and it certainly affected Lopez, who really struggled down the stretch in Minnesota. But we've got plenty of more topics to hit here on this Mailbag Monday episode. We thank you all so much for sending in your questions. Coming up after the break, we're going to talk a little bit about some Orioles who were injured at the end of the season, what their status looks like now. Talk about some potential trades where the Orioles could acquire big league talent this offseason, and also talk a little bit about Anthony Santander. But first, before we do all that, do have to talk about Simply Safe, because Simply Safe, if you are looking to protect your home, just have a little bit of peace of mind, Simply Safe is for you. And as everyone knows, athletes, and especially in Major League Baseball, they rise and they fall in the ranks. But when it comes to saving money, Simply Safe always stays on top. And right now, you can save big with Simply Safe Home Security. They're giving listeners 40% off their advanced security system. Simply Safe was just named the best home security of 2022 by US News. And it's great. You'll love it because at Simply Safe, your safety is the only thing that matters. And they've got 24/7 professional monitoring. When a threat is detected, Simply Safe's monitoring professionals promptly contact you and dispatch first responders to your home, even if you're away or you're unable to respond. And Simply Safe, it blankets your home with protection with advanced sensors for every room, window, and door. And they've got HD security cameras for inside and outside your home and smarter ways to detect motion that only alert you when a threat is real. So don't miss this chance to save big when you protect your home with the best. Get 40% off your order when you visit simplysafe.com/lockedonmlb today. Customize the perfect system for your home in just a few minutes. That's simplysafe.com/lockedonmlb. Go today. There's no safe like Simply Safe. So it's a Mailbag Monday episode of the podcast. Here we are answering your Orioles questions, 9 questions, all from listeners here on today's podcast. And we'll get to our 4th question of the day, which comes from Panorama Jazz Band on YouTube in the comments, who asks, is there any concern with the Felix Bautista injury that forced him to miss the last couple games of the season? And I wanted to expand this question to, is there any concern with any of the guys who missed the end part of the season with injury for the Orioles? So let's start with Felix Bautista. There is not any concern. It's been written about a little bit over the past couple of days. Bautista saying, it was just a shutdown just because he had already pitched a whole lot of innings his first big league season. If the O's were in a pennant race still on that last week, he may have even been able to try and tough it out and pitch. But if it were the middle of the season, it would have been like a classic 15-day injured list. And he's back immediately after those 15 days and good to go. Just a little soreness in the knee. He should be good to go. He's easily going to be fine for spring training and well before that as well. When it comes to Ramon Arias, who had that leg injury in Boston late in the year and missed the remainder of the season, kind of the same thing. Now, for Arias, it would have been, had it come, in June or July, it would have been a little more of a longer-term injury than the Bautista injury was. He may have been on the IL for a month or so, maybe more, but it's not going to be anything that requires big surgery that's going to take him out for a lot of time next year. Arias, if he's still an Oriole, will be back with the team in spring training 2023. Then there's Grayson Rodriguez, of course, who had the lat injury, missed 3 months. Now, for him, he's good to go. I mean, he was pitching in rehab stints. He was back in AAA at the end of the year. And I really thought the O's were going to give him one shot at the big leagues in the final week of the season, especially after they were eliminated from wild card contention. They didn't give him that shot. However, he's healthy, he's good, and he's in a spot to win a rotation job for the Orioles in spring training next year. And lastly is John Means, who, of course, had Tommy John surgery back in April. Of course, we got the update a couple of weeks ago, means throwing for the first time here in October since the Tommy John surgery. Again, do not at all expect John Means to be ready for opening day 2023. It's just not going to happen. But if you circle sometime in June or maybe July, a little before the All-Star break, or maybe at worst right after the All-Star break for Means to really return to the Baltimore Orioles rotation, I think that is certainly a possibility. Next question comes from Adit via YouTube, who asks, who is the most likely to be traded among these infielders? Jordan Westburg, Connor Norby, Joey Ortiz, and Cesar Prieto. And it's a good question, but it kind of involves the answer being, well, who is the trade going to be for? Because if it's going to be for a frontline starting pitcher, you can't really get away with just trading Cesar Prieto. You may have to trade a group of these guys. But if you're going after a solid player right now and you want to, sell high on a player in your system and get a good major leaguer back, I think Joey Ortiz fits that mold. Since being drafted, he had been pegged as a defense first shortstop who had the glove to get to the big leagues, but there were always questions on whether or not his bat could get him to the big leagues. Well, what we saw from Ortiz in the second half of the season with the bat with the Blue Bay Sox and the Norfolk Tides showed that he has the hitting prowess to get to the big leagues. Now, it's a question of whether or not the Orioles think in-house that he can sustain that long-term with the bat. And maybe this would be the time to trade a prospect like that. It kind of seems to me like the perfect time to trade a prospect like Joey Ortiz. And I think he really could be dealt this offseason for some good big league talent. But if the Orioles do go after kind of a frontline-ish starting pitcher, I think Jordan Westburg could certainly be dealt this offseason. I mean, I can see any of these four guys being traded, but if it is a top name guy, I think almost certainly Jordan Westburg will be included in that conversation. Among position players right now for the Orioles, you could argue Jordan Westburg is the best position player prospect for the O's right now who has not gotten to the big leagues yet, or at least the one with the best trade value. So I think that the O's were going to go after a big name guy in trade. Westburg would be the guy that they deal. Next question comes from Wyatt Law, also in the YouTube comments. And Wyatt asks, is Anthony Santander a building block for the future for the Orioles, or is he a trade chip this offseason? And my answer here to Wyatt's question is going to be a little bit of a cop-out, but I don't think he's really either, because I wouldn't quite say Anthony Santander right now is a big-time future building block for the Orioles. He's a little older than some of the other guys that fall into that category. And although he had his best big league season this year, we still haven't fully seen what kind of player he's going to be long term. But I also don't think he's a trade chip. Like at points this year and last offseason, I did think of Anthony Santander as a trade chip. I don't see that anymore. I mean, there's still scenarios where the Orioles could trade him this offseason, especially if it's like the sweetener in a deal to lock up, a good major league starting pitcher coming back. They might make that deal for a team that's looking for big league ready or talent that's already in the big leagues to help their lineup, like the Miami Marlins. But I wouldn't go shopping him around for minor leaguers right now. Santander is a free agent after 2024, so he's got 2 more seasons on his rookie contract right now. And I think right now he's kind of in the middle. He's good for this lineup currently, led the team with 33 homers in 2022. He had a 120 WRC plus. He had 2.5 WAR. According to Fangraphs, his on-base percentage was up. The walk rate was up. He had a much better batter's eye. And the defense was up and down. I mean, playing a little left field, mostly right field. He wasn't the Gold Glove finalist he was in 2020. He wasn't the train wreck he was in 2021 defensively. He was somewhere in between. Maybe long-term, he ends up being a DH who you just kind of sometimes play in the outfield when you need to. But I still think he's valuable and a power source in the middle of the lineup the Orioles didn't really get from anyone else in 2022. So right now, what I would call him is maybe not a long-term building block, but at least a piece in this lineup for the next 2 years who they shouldn't be looking to deal for prospects this offseason. But we got 3 more questions to get to here on this Mailbag Monday episode, and 3 really good ones that I'm excited to talk about. One about what I would do if given a $130 million payroll for the Orioles next season. One question about if the O's would make another trade like the Cole Salser and Tanner Scott one that they made last year right before the season started. And then a question about what 2023 will look like for Jackson Holliday. So we're answering your mailbag questions here on a Mailbag Monday episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. 6 questions down so far, just 3 to go here on the pod. We thank you so much for sending in those questions. Continue to send them in, and we will answer them on future mailbag episodes. But our 7th question of the day comes from John on Twitter, who maybe asked my favorite question I've gotten in these offseason mailbags so far. And John asks, kind of give me a scenario, actually. He said, you're in charge. You have a $130 million payroll. That's your limit you can go to for 2023. And he put one more stipulation in there. He said, essentially, you can only trade 6 players among the current roster of guys who aren't basically going to be free agents and the top 30 prospects. That's how I put it together. Basically, 3 of the top 30 prospects you can trade and 3 of the guys on the roster who will be here for a couple of years. So I looked at that, I crunched the numbers, and here's what I've got. So with the Orioles taking the $23 million of Chris Davis money off the books going into next year, they had about a $63 million payroll, including Chris Davis, in 2022. And now you take that out, it goes down to $40 million. Now, you're going to add some payroll in there as well with some arbitration numbers going up. And let's just assume, you know what, just to have some depth, they pick up the Jordan Lyles option. So yeah, sure. Pick up his option, give me those extra $11 million to have Jordan Lyles. So if you put that all together, that gives you about a $57 million payroll just with Lyles and the arbitration guys all going into next year with, of course, the free agents like Odor and Chirinos coming off the books and Chris Davis off the books as well. So with $57 million, that gives me about $73 million to spend if, like John said, I have $130 million in payroll for next year. And he did say the payroll can increase by about 5% every year moving forward. But I really just wanted to focus on next year. So my first move would be I'm signing Carlos Rodon to a kind of shorter term but big money deal. So a left-hander in Rodon who was fantastic in San Francisco this year, had some great moments in Chicago the couple years before as well. Yes, he's been a little injury prone, but was generally healthy this year in San Francisco. But because of the injury history, I'd give him a 3-year, $90 million deal. Now, if he goes out looking for a 5 or 6 year deal, that's fine. I'm not sure if he's going to get $30 million per year. But if the Orioles can say, hey, we're still maybe a touch worried about your injuries, but we'll make it a shorter deal. We'll give you more annual value. And you give him $30 million a year. So 3 years, $90 million. You bring in Carlos Rodon to kind of head up your rotation along with Grayson Rodriguez starting next year. So then you're down to $43 million left on the payroll. Now, next up in that case, I would go after Trey Turner. Give him the bigger deal. 5 years, $150 million for Trey Turner. I'm locking him down at either shortstop or second base for the next 5 years. A great bat, almost a 130 WRC plus. Good, not great defender, but good at both those positions. Elite speed. You add him in with Mateo and Mullins. You're stealing bases every inning pretty much. And you add a guy who's been on some winning ball clubs and is just a great baseball player that's going to help you in the middle infield. So now you're down to $13 million left. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go get just a left-handed power bat that I think the Orioles need. So I'm going to go get Jock Peterson. And I think I can get him here for 1 year and $10 million. I'm going to give Jock Peterson $10 million. Listen, in terms of Jock Peterson, he certainly didn't have a career year with the San Francisco Giants this year. And again, it was tough for him because he came into a Giants team that was certainly supposed to be great again this year after winning 100+ games in 2021. But they just fell short big time and basically were a 500 ball club. But I thought Jock Peterson at least showed that he can still play. He did get $6 million to play for the Giants last year. I'm upping it to $10 million just to get him to Baltimore because the bat itself was there for Jock Peterson. He had a 144 WRC plus with the San Francisco Giants, over 430 plate appearances. He hit 274. He had a 521 slugging. Because the bat was so good, he's going to cost a little more money, and he might end up with a multi-year deal. But maybe if you can get him for 1 year, $10 million, I'd bring him in to just be an outfield option, sure up maybe the DH spot, get some power from the left side where the power really still plays at Camden Yards. And so I'm left with about $3 million. Now, you could say, oh, go get a backup catcher. No. I'm going to allow the group of Gallagher and Colesbury and Garcia and Ben Boom. One of them is going to emerge as my backup catcher. And what I'm then going to do is I'm going to put together a package that looks something like this. Jordan Westburg Joey Ortiz, Austin Hayes, Ramon Arias, and Daryl Hernandez, I'm going to put together for Shane Bieber and maybe a, young Dominican Summer League FCL pitching prospect. Now, Shane Bieber is going to cost a little bit. Now, he is a free agent after 2024, so you get 2 years of Shane Bieber, but he's hitting arbitration again, and that number is going to go up. But with getting Hayes and Arias's money off the board, you have a little bit of money left in that payroll. Maybe I can move things around. Maybe Trey Turner gets a little bit less money, but I'm going to get Shane Bieber. And yes, math-wise, this goes a little bit over the 130, but maybe I go get Shane Bieber. And then when I do, I trade away Jordan Lyles and I get his $11 million off the books. And that gets me back to that $130 million. Because if you get Shane Bieber and Carlos Rodon, I don't think the Orioles would really need Jordan Lyles going into next year. So you have a rotation of Bieber, Rodon, Grayson Rodriguez, and then, Dean Kramer and Kyle Bradish with Tyler Wells competing and Austin Voth competing and, some guys around who are knocking on the door as well, like DL Hall. Things are sitting pretty. You add Trey Turner and Jock Peterson to your lineup, replacing Hayes and Arias. I think that's a winning ball club that's contending for the playoffs going into 2023. But thank you, John. I very much enjoyed answering that question. Next question comes from Vivek on Twitter, who has been a great listener to the show, who's always, contributing to the conversation as well. And he asks, do you see the Orioles making another Cole Sulser, Tanner Scott type trade during this offseason? If you go back, remember, about a week before opening day this season, the Orioles dealt Tanner Scott and Cole Sulser to the Miami Marlins. They got Antonio Velez back, who was a double-A left-hander who spent a lot of the year injured for the Orioles. They got Kevin Guerrero back, kind of a young teenage outfielder. And then they got a draft pick back, which they turned into Judd Fabian, who just mashed the ball early in the Orioles system. And it was kind of a shocking trade at the time. And I was not a fan of it because it felt like Tanner Scott and Cole Sulser were two of the Orioles' better relievers over the last couple of years, and two of the only guys that Brandon Hyde had really been able to trust at times coming out of the bullpen. But as we saw all season, Mike Elias knew that he had a lot more trustworthy relievers this year, and the Orioles had a top 5 bullpen for most of the season and didn't really miss Sulser and Scott, who didn't exactly pitch amazing. Scott was much better, but Cole Sulser kind of fell off a cliff with the Marlins this year. So to answer the question, could I see another trade like that coming? Yes. Just in general, I think it's because the Orioles are going to continue to build their bullpens like this through waiver claims, through, starters in the minors turned relievers when they get to the big leagues, through, interesting minor league reliever pickups, like a guy like Cole Uvala, who they got in the minor league Rule 5 draft, or Nolan Hoffman, same thing. Or guys like Logan Gillespie or Morgan McSweeney, who, like Gillespie's case, you never saw him being added to the 40-man roster, and then he's in the big leagues this year. Or, finally getting guys like Nick Vespi and Felix Bautista to the big leagues after a long time in the minor leagues. I think the O's can successfully keep building a bullpen like that. And because of that, they're going to try to capitalize on some value of some guys and also maybe trade them before they implode, because relievers are so volatile. A lot of them will implode from time to time. So the one guy I'm targeting, I don't know if it'll be a 2-player trade like the Sulser Scott one was, but the guy I would target in this scenario is Cionel Pérez. Now, he's 26 years old, really had his first good year in the big leagues. Well, he struggled to throw strikes with the Astros and with the Reds as a young player, comes over on waivers and became like a 7th and 8th inning and sometimes closer role for the Orioles. Had a 1.41 ERA for the O's this year, but that ERA was a little shaky because according to StatCast, despite a 1.41 ERA for Pérez this year, he had a 3.62 expected ERA. That 2.2 run difference between his actual ERA and expected ERA was by far the largest gap between actual and expected ERA of any pitcher in Major League Baseball this year. Any pitcher in the majors, he had that largest gap. His K rate was just above average. I mean, his walk rate was a little above average as well. Some of these numbers not super elite. He, got hit hard at times, got lucky at times. And again, all of his expected stats across the board worse than his actual stats. So it tells you he's due to regress next year. And I still think that the stuff is good. Big fastball, good slider. And I still think he could be a useful middle reliever on the Orioles next year, even if he does regress. But I don't think Cionel Pérez is going to be the guy he was this year for the Orioles next year. So maybe they identify a couple of prospects they want to go get. They trade away Cionel Pérez this offseason to a team that's desperate for bullpen help heading into the year. And they supplant it with, Nick Vespi being more of a full-time guy. Maybe Keegan Aiken works more shorter stints as a lefty out of the pen. And then other guys between the Logan Gillespies and the Cole Uvalas and, all these guys in AAA who could move up there and other waiver claims as well could kind of fill in that role for Perez, and the O's would just keep humming along out of the bullpen. And then the last question of the day comes from Dan Heron on Twitter, who asks, what is the ceiling for Jackson Holliday in 2023? And he asks, is it AA? And I think, Dan, it probably is AA for Jackson Holliday. Again, the Orioles took Holliday with the number 1 overall pick in the 2022 MLB draft, played a few games in the FCL and rookie ball before moving up to Delmarva at the end of the season. 12 games for the Shorebirds. He had 57 plate appearances, hit .238 with a .439 on base and a .333 slugging percentage. Now, he was 10 for 42 with 4 doubles and 6 singles, not a whole lot of power, but 6 RBIs, and he had 15 walks to just 10 strikeouts in that time with the Shorebirds. An incredible batter's eye. The power is going to come around when he plays a full season. Now, I could certainly see him starting the year with the Shorebirds again, going back to Delmarva this year, but I think it'll probably be a quick promotion to High A Aberdeen, and then it'll be like us just looking at how well he does in Aberdeen. And if he performs in Aberdeen, he could get that late season bump to AA Bowie. Now, remember, he's only going to be 19 years old next year. He turns 19 on December 4th, so it'll be his age 19 season. I don't expect him at all to get to AAA in any scenario. But at 19, if he finishes the year at AA with good stats, he's kind of on the Gunnar Henderson pathway to the big leagues. He then starts 2024 in AA, hits well, gets himself to AAA Norfolk, and after the All-Star break in 2024, maybe you're starting to think about a 20-year-old Holliday getting to the big leagues. And if not, and if it takes a little slower, maybe the opening day roster in 2025 includes Jackson Holliday as well. But I definitely think the ceiling for Holliday is kind of a good final month at AA in 2023. But I thank you all for your questions here on a Mailbag Monday episode. We'll have more mailbags coming up throughout the offseason, so remember to get those questions in. Email us at lockedonorioles@gmail.com. Tweet us at LockedOnOrioles or at Connor Newcomb _ DM either account. You can leave a comment right here in the YouTube comments to ask a question or ask one in the review section on Apple Podcasts. But we thank you all for your questions here on a Mailbag Monday. Now, I'll be back with you here on the podcast tomorrow on Tuesday. We'll get back to our 2022 Orioles player season review series. And we're taking a look at a guy who only spent a month in the big leagues, but certainly made his impact known and looks to be a star for years to come. Yeah, we're going to be reviewing the season of Gunnar Henderson. That's coming up on tomorrow's episode. You won't want to miss that one. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.